Hi guys, today we are going to solve quadratic equations again by looking at the graphing and the square root methods. When you're looking at a graph, if it's a quadratic, the graph is going to be a parabola, which is a U-shape, and to find the solution of the graph, you're going to see where it crosses the x-axis. Another name for the solution of the graph is a zero, an x-intercept, or a root. I will say find the solutions in my directions, but occasionally you might hear me say, okay, let's find the zero, let's find the x-intercept, or let's find the root. They all four mean the same thing. If you want to actually find the solution is where the graph crosses the x-axis. So the x-axis is right here. The x-axis is always the one that's horizontal, right? That's the x, that's the y. So my parabola is this U-shaped graph here, here, and here. If the U-shaped graph crosses the x-axis twice, like it does in the first picture, that means we have two solutions. Where it crosses, at -1 and +1, are the actual solutions. If the parabola crosses the x-axis once in the second picture, that means the number of solutions is 1 and the value of the x is the actual solution. So in this case it is 1. If the graph, like in this picture here, does not cross through the x-axis, that means you have zero solutions. And so you would just say that you don't have any. Now I want to show you how factoring and solving equations by factoring, which is what you did in your last homework, relates to these graphs. We know that this graph touches the x-axis right here at -3 and right here at +3. So if my directions just say solve by graphing, then that's all I would have to do, and I would get my two answers and I would be done. I want to show you how it's related to factoring. So in this case, actually I'm not going to show you that today. What you did right there is good enough. We don't have to go any further. You just have to look to see where it crosses the x-axis and we're done. In example 2, the x-axis is right here, and this graph does not cross the x-axis, so you would say that we have no solution. We have no x-intercepts, we have no roots, so because the parabola itself, which the parabola is down here, does not cross the x-axis. So remember, when the directions say solve by graphing, all you have to do is look to see where your parabola touches the x-axis and write down those numbers. The second method we're going to work with today is solving by square roots. The rules you want to follow are in this oval. First thing you want to do is get the x squared by itself. After you get the x squared by itself, you want to take the square root of both sides. When you take the square root of both sides, you have to make sure you include a plus and a minus with your answer. So again, you're going to get two answers. One's going to be positive and one's going to be negative. And most importantly, this method only works when there is no x term. So if you look down below at all of these examples, you have an x squared term and you have just a plain old number. You have an x squared term and then you have a plain old number. The problems we've been doing have had 2x squared plus 10x minus 1. So when the x term is missing, that's when you can use the square root method. To use the square root method, you want to get the x squared by itself. So if we're looking at number 3, that means I'm going to add 32 to both sides. That gives me 2x squared equals 32. Now I can divide by 2, and I get x squared equals 16. So the next step for me to solve this problem is to take the square root of both sides. Ding, 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 ding. There's that bell again. When you guys take the square root of both sides, you have to remember to include a plus or minus in your answer. The square root of x squared is always just x. The square root cancels out that squared. And then the square root of 16 is 4. You guys can use your calculator to find that answer. So your final answer is x equals 4 and x equals negative 4. You don't have to write them out twice like I did here in the cloud. You can just write x equals plus or minus 4. That means if you were to graph this parabola, it would cross the x-axis at 4 and negative 4. On example number 4, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to isolate the x squared term by subtracting 108 from both sides. I get negative 3x squared equals negative 108. I divide by negative 3, and I get x squared equals 36. So now I need to take the square root of both sides. Ding, 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 ding. When you take the square root of both sides, that means you have to include a plus and a minus in your answer. The square root of x squared is always just x because the square root cancels out the squared. And the square root of 36 done on your calculator is 6. Please, please, please use your calculator. All right, moving on to the next one. Remember, you can only use this method when you have the x term missing. So you have an x squared term and a plain old number. On number 5, I'm going to start by subtracting 50 from both sides. So I get 2x squared equals negative 50. Then I divide by 2, and I get x squared equals negative 25. Now remember, if I'm talking too fast for you, pause the video and allow yourself time to write this down and process it. Once I get to this point, I can take the square root of both sides. But this one's different. This is our special case. We have a negative underneath our radical. So on your calculator, if you take the square root of negative 25, you're going to get no solution, or you're going to get an error. You are not allowed to take the square root of negative numbers. So anytime you have a negative under the radical, that's the ding, ding, ding. Something else is wrong with this problem. You definitely have to make sure you're aware that you can only take the square root of positive numbers. So let's try number 6. On number 6, I'm going to subtract 25, and I get 5x squared equals 0. That's not negative, so it's okay, so we keep going. So we divide both sides by 5, and we get x squared equals 0. Well, when you take the square root of both sides, again, you're going to do this on your calculator, you get the square root of 0 to be 0. You don't have to include the plus or minus here because you can't have a positive 0 and a negative 0. 0 is just 0. So the only time you include plus or minus is when you're taking the square root of a positive number that's bigger than 0. On example number 7, we don't have to move anything over to the other side by adding or subtracting. We can go straight to isolating the squared term by dividing both sides by 4. So that leaves us with x squared equals 25 divided by 4 is a decimal. So when we get a decimal, we just leave it as a fraction. You're still going to go through the process of taking the square root of both sides. And when you take the square root of a positive number, don't forget to include plus or minus in your answer. But what you have to remember on this one is that when you take the square root of fractions, you take the square root of the top and the square root of the bottom. So your final answer is x equals plus or minus, the square root of 25 is 5, and the square root of 4 is 2. So you get x equals plus or minus 5/2. I am okay if you did this on your calculator, if you write your answer as a decimal. So I would take that answer also. So if you don't like the fractions, go ahead and take the square root of 25 divided by 4 and write that decimal. That's it for the notes today. 3 things I want you to remember. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. Remember that the square root of 0 is 0. And when you take the square root of a positive number, you must include plus or minus with your answer. Please, please, please email me if you guys have any questions. Have a great one. Bye.